Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. We're thrilled to have so many wonderful people joining this important event. My name is Ali Greenberg. I'm currently a medical student, but I've worked in access to medicines for almost a decade with Universities Allied for Essential Medicines and many of our other partners. And I serve on Right to Health Action's events team and board of directors. Right to Health Action is a grassroots movement of volunteers dedicated to pragmatically fighting for health equity. We came together as a team in response to the COVID-19 pandemic based on a shared belief that health is a human right. As we enter into our second year as an organization and the number of lives lost to COVID-19 continues to tick upward, it is more important than ever that we celebrate the efforts of those working tirelessly to mitigate the physical and emotional damage of this pandemic and to prevent those of the future. Today, we are honored to have Amber Carter here with us. Amber is a pastoral life coordinator, Marine spouse, and mom to 5 kids ages 3 to 18. She's also a member of the national nonpartisan group COVID Survivors for Change and creator of the Facebook group Parents Who Have Lost a Child to COVID-19. Amber's goal is to educate people through her family's experience about the fact that children are also vulnerable to COVID-19. Before we jump into our panel today, I'd like to turn it over to Amber to share her story about why she has joined the fight with Right to Health Action.
Hello, everybody. My name's Amber, and my family lived on Fort Sill Army Post when the pandemic hit and everything shut down. In fact, all the military installations had more restrictions than the rest of the country in the beginning, and they still do. We pretty much stayed at home because, frankly, we didn't know what we were dealing with, and the leadership across the country lacked the valuable information that we now have. My family wasn't considered high risk according to the CDC, so we're not too worried, though our 13-year-old daughter, Anna, was slightly immunocompromised because of her autoimmune disease, scleroderma. She just had gotten a clean bill of health at her rheumatology appointment in June, and she was pretty much living her best life as a teenager. She was on the lowest dose of medications they had to manage any symptoms of this illness, and was a typical teenage kid. Anna loved to dance with her dance studio. She aspired to be an actress when she grew up. If that didn't pan out for her, she planned on going to medical school to be a physician, like the ones who treated her at the Children's Hospital. She was hysterical. She made everyone smile and laugh that she met. She had an empathy that I had only seen in my other children times 10. She could tell when somebody was sad or hurting, and she would be the first to befriend them. She always said she knew what it felt like to be the new kid or be the outsider, and she didn't want anyone to feel like that. She was such an amazing human, and she was mine. Anna has 4 siblings she was very close to, an older brother and sister, a younger brother and sister. They did everything together. You can probably hear them in the background right now. As a military family, we traveled a lot, so they got used to being each other's companions and friends. And her older siblings had just started driving and taking her places, which she thought was the coolest thing ever, and she couldn't wait for her turn to drive. We had planned on taking a trip to Dallas, Legoland, but we canceled in the spring of 2020 because Dallas had 35 known cases there. We didn't want to chance it. I wish now that we had gone. It would have been the last time we went on a family trip, and she would have been able to drive a Lego car. And, I just wish we had gone. We have no idea where any of us got COVID, who got it first or anything, because we didn't know we had it until the day Anna passed away. On July 5th, Anna started not to feel well. This was right after I had a sinus infection the week before that the urgent care gave me steroids and antibiotics for and sent me home. They never tested me for COVID, or we might not be in this mess. She felt worn down a bit, but good enough to go to dance on Monday and Tuesday. However, Tuesday, after dance class, her stomach hurt a little bit and her joints were achy, which was not uncommon for her when she overdid things with her scleroderma. So we kept her home and we told her to rest for the week. We thought maybe she was feeling better because she was eating and drinking and playing on her computer with her friends. But Friday rolled around and she just looked terrible. We took her to the ER and her body turned septic within an hour of arriving there, and then she was gone. Sorry. If Anna were here today, she would have the opportunity to get her vaccine, and I would have taken her on the advice of her doctors. We as Americans have such a great opportunity to have vaccines, but many of our countrymen take it for granted. I have read on average that 1 in 4 people of high income countries have received a vaccine, compared with just 1 in 500 in low-income countries. Higher income countries have received most of the world's supply, while the poor countries have obtained less than 1%. NPR reported that 41% of the United States is fully vaccinated at this point. We need to get those numbers as high across the globe to avoid the further variants that will be able to evade this vaccine-produced antibodies.
Thank you so much for sharing your powerful story with us tonight, Amber, and I'm so sorry for your loss. Your experiences and those of countless others worldwide really do drive home the importance of fighting for substantial changes to U.S. public health and global health policy at this crucial moment in time. As an organization, one of our key policy priorities at Right to Health Action is to ensure equitable access to vaccines and all other health technologies worldwide. Starting tomorrow, the 2021 G7 Leaders Summit is convening. Since the G7 last met just 4 months ago, more than 1 million additional people have died from COVID-19. At current vaccination rates, low-income countries will be waiting 57 years for everyone to be fully vaccinated. 57 years. Or the G7 and its member nations, including the United States, could act to end pharma monopolies and protect people from pandemics, regardless of their ability to pay. Just a few weeks ago, we did have a monumental win in the fight for access to the COVID-19 vaccine, when activists pressured Biden to support negotiations for a Trips Waiver, and recently his administration agreed to share the US's vaccine surplus with other countries, as well as purchase and donate additional vaccines. And just this week, the US, China, and 19 other members of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation came out in favor of a Trips Waiver, showing further global alignment to end vaccine apartheid and save countless lives. But in order for these commitments to go well beyond charitable donations and turn into justice-oriented action with a long-term impact, we need to expand on these commitments and garner increased global support for a people's vaccine. Today, we will be getting into the details as we discuss what the TRIPS agreement is and the intersections between international trade law, intellectual property, patents, and vaccine access. But we will more importantly take the time to dissect the current global system for vaccine development and supply, how it was created, and ultimately how we can collectively fight for the policies that can change it for the better. Together, Right to Health Action is taking action to promote these policies as part of our ongoing work to end this pandemic and prevent pandemics of the future, alongside many organizations who have been leaders in the access to medicines movement since the fight for affordable and accessible medications reached new heights with the start of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Today, we are joined by representatives from 3 of these longstanding advocacy groups, HealthGap, the MSF Access Campaign, and I-MAK. We are so grateful and honored to have these 3 speakers with us today to discuss the roadmap for global vaccine equity and what we can do to ensure millions around the world receive their shot in the short term, and that medicines are made for people and not for profit in the longer term. Before I hand it over to our moderator, Matthew Rose, I want to take this opportunity to thank him and our 2 panelists, as well as our R2H team members, who have joined us for multiple meetings to make this event happen. If you're interested in being involved in our community going forward, we'll be following up with information on how that is possible. Let me also quickly cover the agenda for the evening. Following our panel and an audience Q&A, we will invite each of you to join a short small group discussion to debrief, connect with other like-minded advocates, and highlight points of resonance. We have a team of trained small group facilitators who have stepped up to create space for these conversations and to help us close out the event. And we want to offer a huge thanks to them for taking this on. A couple of notes on technology. All attendees will be muted during this discussion. If you have to leave the meeting at any point or get kicked out and want to rejoin, you can simply use the same link that you used at the beginning of the event. You can submit questions via the chat at any time, and these will be referred to when we have our Q&A at the end of the panel discussion. We're also recording the panel portion of this webinar, which will be shared within the coming week. And after the panel and Q&A, we will share the specific instructions surrounding logistics for moving to small groups, as well as closing out the webinar following our conversations. With that, let me introduce Matthew Rose. Matthew is a long-standing HIV and social justice advocate, policy wonk, and Director of U.S. Policy and Advocacy at HealthGap, or the Global Access Project.
Ali, can you hear me? Ali, can you hear me?
Yes, sorry.
I'm so sorry to do this. We have a health emergency in the family. I have to run to the hospital. Okay, I'm so sorry. I have to go.
Oh my God. Okay, that's
Thanks for understanding.
Go. Of course.
Okay, bye.
I'm so sorry guys, it sounds like something is happening with one of our main speakers, Priti. We can have a conversation with Matthew and Leena, and perhaps some of our team members, and we'll hopefully be able to still discuss some of this really important information about global vaccine access. And hopefully everything will be okay. We'll follow up with Priti after the event. So as I was saying, Matthew is at the Global Access Project, which is an international advocacy organization founded in 1999 and dedicated to ensuring that all people living with HIV have access to life-saving medicines, that there is sufficient funding to ensure access, and that treatment programs deliver quality care. We want to thank you so much for joining us and moderating today's conversation, Matthew. I'll let you go ahead and share a bit more about your work. And I'd still love if you could just share a bit about Priti, and we can share some resources as well about her work after the event. And then you can discuss the focus of today's discussion.
Excellent. So glad to be here and so happy to have everyone join us this evening. I'm Matthew Rose. Like I said, I'm the Director of U.S. Advocacy, U.S. Policy and Advocacy at HealthCap. HealthCap's been around for a minute. We are excited for this moment to talk to people about finally changing some of the landscape that we've all recognized for a while that has been problematic. The HIV movement went through this back in the early 2000s. When HealthCap was formed, when we realized that triple combination drug therapy was not reaching outside of the US borders. And so the great effects that we were seeing in the United States were not connecting. And now we're seeing so many parallels between the beginnings of our pandemic and what's happening now. And the question is, will we allow it? We have entered into a moment where we can really start thinking about what does fundamental structural change look like to allow us not only to win this fight, but win the fights of the future. It does us no good to keep having to have the same battle over pharmaceutical products every time a pandemic hits and every time the people have to rise up and overcome. And so HealthCap is excited to be in this fight on COVID-19. I think half my time these days is on COVID stuff and the other half is on HIV, but it's all in towards the greater good of changing the framework. And we're going to have an amazing panel, and it'll be a great discussion with Leena and I, talking about people who've really been thinking about what does it take to change some of the ways in the more weeds part of it of getting access to medicines. It's not so simple as we say. There's a thicket of things one has to burst through, change, that companies have put up as barriers, that we have to negotiate to really change the landscape. So Priti, who's not able to join us today, is an expert at this. She is a health justice lawyer and the co-founder of I-MAK. It's an initiative for medicines, access, and knowledge. And they're a nonprofit that's been really built on how do we change the medical system and how do we change patent law. So she's been doing this for before COVID even started about how do we actually fix the patent system that the United States is probably the biggest abuser of, in the sense that we use our pharmaceutical companies that are based here and we push those patents and through our trade policy onto other countries. And Priti has been there from the beginning trying to change these laws and make for more equitable access, especially in the global South. Next, we have Leena, who works at one of my favorite organizations, Doctors Without Borders, which, as many of you know, Leena has worked on access to medicines and is the head of the Regional Bureau for Southern Asia, which I will tell you that if you work in access to medicines at all, you will go through this part of the world, because this is part of the world where a lot of the policy meets the road. This is where the bulk of generic manufacturers live, and the people who have to go through the patents and industrial design secrets and trade secrets and all the other things that make up access to our variable medicines become really important. And so to start the conversation, I want to have Leena tell you a little about what her organization and she does, but also tell it how that's changed in the COVID context. And one of the things that Leena and I were talking about at the beginning is right now, everyone's really focused on vaccines. But as we know in the HIV space and in other spaces, it's not just about the vaccine we need to get access for, it's all COVID technologies. So getting the ability to not have just vaccines, but diagnostics, treatments, potentially preventatives, and then a vaccine are all going to be part of getting a robust response necessary. But Leena, tell us what you do and tell us how it's been looking in these last crazy, 18 months and before.
So I work with Doctors Without Borders, and Doctors Without Borders started to treat people in the 70s, and very quickly ran into a roadblock. One was, of course, that many of the treatments that they were providing just were not effective or they were toxic. And the other was that it was really unaffordable to provide treatment to people with the kind of drugs as we spoke about with HIV/AIDS. And in the late 1990s, right at the peak of the AIDS epidemic, when people were being left at our clinics in Thailand and in many parts of Africa for just palliative care, people would abandon people living with HIV, their loved ones, at our clinics because there was absolutely no life-saving treatment available. At that point of time, a part of MSF's movement decided that they would put people on antiretrovirals, and this challenged the organization to do something about the barriers to these treatments and the cost and the supply of these drugs. And we started to look at generic manufacturing, competition. Why should we just buy a drug from Pfizer? Or why should we buy a drug from Boehringer? Or why should we just simply buy a drug from Merck? Why not look at alternative suppliers? And I think that's where the conversation about alternative supply came about and competition came about. And we realized very quickly that treatments could be a fraction of the cost what multinational corporations were charging treatment providers. And I am part of that unit that was born out of the AIDS epidemic, and now work on a number of other treatments that are monopolized and not available. So that's just the start of where we are in MSF. On vaccines itself, I've worked on the pneumonia vaccine, and strangely enough, as treatment activists, you realize that sometimes certain things you work on happen to cross your personal life as well. So I've worked on, both pneumonia and hepatitis C, and are very up close. I have seen the monopolies, how they affect your loved ones. My father had pneumonia, and I very quickly realized that no one actually was vaccinated against pneumonia, not the kids and not the older people who really needed it. And one of the key reasons why people are not vaccinated against pneumonia in the developing world is the vaccine is too expensive and the vaccine is monopolized by Pfizer. And that is how I think we, as MSF, we worked on drugs and we worked on vaccines that are very expensive, a very necessary part of the health system. And we started to challenge them, not just publicly, but in courts and in patent offices. And we would really, I think the journey now has sort of hit a peak with all our expertise coming together for COVID-19.
That's great. I think back to some of the early days of this work and really having speaking truth to power. I know AIDS activists famously bird dog and we'll say aggressively followed a former presidential candidate named Al Gore with signs about what are you doing for HIV and why aren't you breaking the patents? And we've seen kind of perniciously that corporations and governments have allowed their trade patents to get more expansive over the years. And it's really done a number on folks. How have you kind of fought back on this level as we watch corporations try to find more ways to get around, well, we'll give you generic access to this drug that's 12 years old, but this new thing that works like 5 times as good, we're going to wait on that for the rest of the globe.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to be a certain kind of positive person to be able to take on pharma because it's such a difficult battle. If you look at the beginning of AIDS, and we were using a drug called stavudine, which was extremely toxic, caused neuropathy, and we were just waiting for this drug from Gilead Sciences called tenofovir for a decade. The only way to get access to tenofovir, which is now the backbone of HIV treatment across the developing world, was, just 2 things. One was pure public activism, where we got onto the streets to challenge and sort of, highlight what was happening in South Africa and India on tenofovir. The second was that we all got together and, the world's poorest organizations managed to challenge the patent of Gilead in the Indian Patent Office. And that quickly changed the power equation. So when you challenge monopolies and you challenge patents, no matter how poor an organization you are, you actually change the system. And it just changes the system from a donation where you get a few donations if you protest, to a system where actually you are able to make the medicines yourself. We've seen antiretrovirals being produced by Brazil, Thailand, India, and I'm sure others have aspirations to make them too. So I just wanted to say this, that if you can take donations, you can utilize donations, but the long-term sustainability is in removing those patent barriers in the first place, or monopoly barriers as we speak, and getting a more sustainable and more fairer and I think more equitable system. No one really likes to take charity. What everyone wants is to be able to sustain themselves. And I think that is the equation we struck in India and places like South Africa. Yeah.
I can't help but bring up, to get your opinion on the United States just offered we're donating 500 million doses, which we all know that's Pfizer. So that's only 250 million people. Remember people, we need 7 billion. So math not really waking up there. And COVAX, another kind of donate some dollars so we can buy some doses, at best vaccinates 27% of low and middle income countries. Where are we going wrong with this? Is this? I thought donations just solved all of our problems. I mean,
yeah.
What do we do? What do we do else? What should we really be doing, and not thinking about donations? But what do we really need to win in countries?
Yeah, absolutely. So donations bring out two pernicious problems with the system. One is that they never actually reach everybody who needs access. So donations always are a mismatch to the kind of demand that you have for treatment or vaccines. In India, when we had Gavi fund pneumonia in India, Pneumonia Vaccine in India, Gavi's funding only reached 20% of the kids who needed to be vaccinated with the pneumonia vaccine. So we got the aid from Gavi, but it was just not enough to meet the kind of need that we have for the pneumonia vaccine. And somehow the pneumonia support we got from Gavi is exactly what I sort of think about the U.S. support through COVAX with the 500 million doses. Very welcome, but you are basically throwing 500 million doses for 250 million people into a system which basically will then have to decide who gets it or not, And by the very nature that it's coming so late, right after the pandemic, second waves have already started to hit our countries. And, it's going to be a huge challenge. Where do you send these vaccines? Should you send it to the countries who are undergoing a second wave? Should you send it to the countries who may be vulnerable to the second wave? So they are just not enough, and they're coming quite late after, for example, in India, we've gone through a vicious second wave where thousands of people, if not nearly 1 million people, are going to lose their lives to the pandemic. We would very much have liked, not a trickle-down theory, as I say, but an equal participation theory. Right at the time when the United States started to manufacture vaccines for itself, they would have given us the rights to manufacture the vaccines for people in India and other developing world. So that would have been a more equal equation to equitable access.
It's almost like we let pharmaceutical companies create a false scarcity and stop other producers from, I don't know, solving that scarcity, and then get surprised that there's not enough vaccine doses. I wonder who created that system. What are the people who got billions of dollars richer? It can't be them. Never. But what do we do? What can change? We're talking about, there's a lot of talk about the Trips Waiver and what that would mean. You have the head of the USAID task force saying that they're going to be financing some manufacturers in India and Bangladesh and somewhere, they say Africa, as if the whole continent is one country, but we're going to finance Africa. So what can we be doing? What does this kind of sustainable system look like? And who's getting in the way of it?
Yeah. So it's interesting that you asked that question, because almost everyone's asked me, the Trips Waiver will not solve all our problems, it's not going to get vaccines into people's hands the very next day. But what the Trips Waiver does is it shifts the power from pharmaceutical corporations into the hands of people and governments. And I think that one of the reasons why the Trips Waiver has garnered such immense support among people who may not understand the complexities of intellectual property law, but definitely understand that pharmaceutical companies have messed up in COVID dramatically. First, if you look at, Pfizer's denial of the technology on mRNA, or if you look at the kind of situation on AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute deal, where only a single manufacturer was given exclusive rights for the developing world. And when India hit the wave, we ran out of vaccines very quickly for ourselves, but also the rest of the developing world. When pharma has set up the rules and pharma has decided who gets vaccines and who doesn't get vaccines, we've really seen a lot of inequality. And unfortunately, this inequality has, dimensions of the fact that this is an inequality between the North and South and the rich and poor, people of color versus, people who are extremely privileged to be living in developed countries where governments are able to, not only pay for the research, but then buy it back for millions and millions and billions of dollars. So I think in that sense, the Trips Waiver has sort of changed the equation in terms of the debate, shifting it away from pharmaceutical corporations about what governments should do. And I think it sort of has this immense ability, the Trips Waiver, to mobilize people. And while it may not be the perfect solution, it is something that actually forces governments to talk about what they will do. And this is where the whole discussion about the US supporting manufacturing in developing countries comes up. I'm not going to speak to what's happening in Africa, but I can say one thing. More than actually setting up manufacturing in India, what we needed was a more collaborative work on the technology a year ago, and we would not have been faced with such a acute shortage in the middle of the pandemic. So yes, you can come about with a plan. It's not that the Indians don't know how to manufacture. The Indians know very well how to manufacture, and so do the Bangladeshis and the Egyptians, people of color and people in developing countries, and pharmaceutical companies there. The public sector there has capacity to produce. The problem being that in a pandemic, you forced us to take the longer route, which was to find and develop the technology all over again, which is what the developing world essentially does. When something new comes up, we just either go round and make it, which takes a longer time, or we develop the technology ourselves through our public labs, and that takes time. We could have changed that equation in the pandemic. And unfortunately, just setting up manufacturing units without discussing the rules about sharing technology or waiving intellectual property. Do you want us to be contract manufacturers? Is my question to the United States and to others. No, we are talking about learning the technology and being able to sustain production ourselves. So it's not about contract manufacturing. It's not about teaching the Indians how to manufacture, but it's really essentially about collaboration in a pandemic. And that could have happened a year ago, just as when the pandemic started and these vaccine candidates and drug candidates were coming off the shelves.
Yeah, it's always interesting to watch, like we could have gone right and been really happy. Actually, let's be better. We're American. This is prime American knowledge. We could have gone left and been really happy, but instead we went right back to the place that allowed us in this bad position we're in. And I know as HIV advocates, we saw what happens when you get a breakthrough, like a Doha Declaration. We also saw what happens when you get a Doha Declaration, and people are like, well, what does that mean, Matt? I'm like, it means you get an agreement that's watered down, and your pandemic doesn't actually get to end, but you get to have some wind taken out of its sails, and you end up with this kind of weird compromise of like, well, we slowed it down, so that's enough. So I guess, Leena, I want you to talk a little about, what about all the other COVID technology pieces? Because we know with HIV, we were great and we got our ARVs. What we didn't get is some of our other testing technologies that we needed and had to fight for later. What we haven't got is like protections on future stuff that's coming out now. So now that we have injections coming to the market, we don't have really great protections on those, and we're gonna have to have that fight again. So what about the in-between? Because as I say, when you're thinking about a pandemic, you've got to be able to detect it, you've got to prevent, treat, and then think about the long-term ending pieces. And everyone thinks the vaccine is a holy grail to getting to that. But everyone knows that even at the most aggressive levels, it takes a while to scale up vaccines. So what do you do for people who have stuff now? What do you do for people who need treatment now? People who are on ventilators now, or could be soon, before vaccines are even available in their countries? What do those fights look like?
The fight is about that everyone just wants to talk. So one of the strategies that has been followed is to fixate the conversation to vaccines only. And we are treatment activists, and we know very well that you can't get through an infectious disease by just trying to prevent it. You've got to test and treat. And that's where actually a lot of us in developing countries who've actually seen one of the, I live in India, and now, neighboring Nepal is going through a huge wave of the pandemic. And what we really noticed was this very simple equation that, if we had something for resource poor settings that prevented hospitalization, and, our health systems are not geared for mass hospitalization and, ventilators and ICUs. And what happens is a collapse. And what happened really is this, that we just could not provide oxygen to the number of people who needed it. If we had been able to treat people very early on with the treatments that would prevent them from getting very sick and needing hospitalization, you would have seen a completely different outcome. We saw this with AIDS when we got the antiretrovirals. And I think this is where I think the turning point in pandemic has to come. We have to acknowledge that the pandemic is here to stay in our communities. There will always be an outbreak. There will always be people who are getting sick with COVID-19. And we really need the drugs. We need the antivirals, pretty much what we did for hepatitis C and HIV. And we need to be equipped as healthcare systems to be able to treat as much as to prevent. And I think this is really very important. And number two, I think, is not many people know that, people in India are dying of an opportunistic infection. All of us in AIDS know opportunistic infections. Our ears go up when we hear opportunistic infections, because they kill more people with HIV than anything else. And in India, we have this fungal infection, mucor, or known popularly as black fungus. And it's killing people because it's a very aggressive fungal infection that overtakes your immune system right when it's completely compromised. And the drug liposomal amphotericin B, Ambisome, has been monopolized by Gilead for 20 years under a trade secret. So the technology to make a liposomal form of amphotericin B, in lipids, in layers, in composition, has all been monopolized by Gilead Sciences. And one company, we are dependent on one company to give us that drug across the world. And when mucor hit us in India, we just did not have enough vials. And I just wanted to say this: why are we repeating this? Again and again, pharma companies, the same issue with same drugs, one supplier. And somehow this reminds me of the beginning of AIDS with fluconazole, with what we faced with Pfizer on fluconazole is exactly what we faced on the mRNA vaccine. And now, once again, we are facing a situation in India where, something like liposomal amphotericin B, which every AIDS activist knows for cryptococcal meningitis, has been in short supply, too expensive. And, people with COVID-19 are dying without that drug as well. And there's no guarantee that people in Nepal will get it. So I think there's such huge parallels to what we've been through. And somehow we just don't seem to learn our lessons as governments, as people. We just leave all the power to pharma companies. And I think that's why the Trips Waiver is so very important.
Absolutely there. I think we have let pharmaceutical companies write the rules of the road for so long that even they are on cruise control and are just like, no, we'll vaccinate the world. It's fine. We've never made this many doses before. Clearly a company can solve this. And you're like, again, 7 billion people. That's how many potentially need to get near a vaccination at some point. How do you get there, pharmaceutical companies? Just in April, we got to the billionth dose. That should scare some people. Maybe we need to change things up. But what kind of keeps governments down? Why do you think governments are so afraid of tackling pharma? I know India has done an amazing job of saying, we will make the developing world's drugs. And that's had its pluses and minuses. But what has allowed you all to kind of, and the activists in your country who have pushed this so well, to kind of make this happen, get the kind of throw pharma off their game and said, we're going to push back and we're going to push back hard?
Yeah. So I think people in developing countries or anywhere in the world are stuck between government and pharmaceutical corporations when it comes to access to treatment. Our governments, of course, know what needs to be done. And I worked on breast cancer when, Roche had a monopoly on this drug called trastuzumab, which was not being offered, to women with HER2 breast cancer, simply because it was too expensive. And every time this whole issue comes around, you have not just very powerful pharmaceutical corporations who have very high level contacts with your government, but they are backed by very powerful governments on the other side. And, we've seen this with Gilead Sciences and hepatitis C drug sofosbuvir. We've seen that they have advocated for monopolies on sofosbuvir. And anybody who's worked on hepatitis C knows Gilead Sciences very, very well, and knows that, pharmaceutical corporations will use whatever mechanisms they have, including utilizing very powerful governments to back and pressure governments into doing what they want, which is to grant patents, to protect the monopolies at the cost of people. The only way you can push back, and I think this is where our fight on patent challenges has a huge connection to the Trips Waiver, is that we realized we had power when we, as the most poorest NGOs and community groups, Loon Gante and my friends who come from the HIV networks, from very small organizations, the power equation changed when they started to go to the patent office and challenge the monopolies as people living with HIV. And I think that actually stunned the governments, including India, into doing something about generics for newer generation of antiretrovirals. But it also stunned Gilead Sciences into doing something about access to tenofovir and other antiretrovirals. And I think the only way if we are to do something about COVID-19 inequality, we need some power back into our hands as people to be able to march and confront the pharmaceutical corporation, but also to put pressure on our own governments to act. And I think the Trips Waiver is that key. Just as the first patent challenge in India sort of, caught the imagination of the whole community of people living with HIV and mobilized all of us to get together. Similarly, in the Trips Waiver has galvanized people into understanding what's wrong with the pharma model. Why is it that you have to wait 2 years to see an mRNA vaccine? Only after everyone in the US is vaccinated, you're like second-class global citizens in some sense. Why do you have to wait so long to get the very same things that would save your lives? I think that's where the equation sort of starts changing, when you find a way to challenge the monopolies. And we found a way to challenge an individual monopoly on tenofovir. But, in Trips Waiver, we realized, why did we do it for AIDS? It was a no-brainer. Waive all IP on COVID-19. We should have done it for HIV. AIDS, not gone drug by drug, company by company, country by country challenging patents. Doha was good, but it really is very tiresome to challenge intellectual property country by country. So in that sense, the Trips Waiver is a no-brainer for me. And I'm waiting for the treatments, for the pills that can go into bodies that can prevent us from getting sick from COVID-19. And to do that, we need the Trips Waiver.
Yeah, I always tell people the reason that the trips matter, and people are like, push back, it's not going to get you X tomorrow. I'm like, nothing gets me a vaccine tomorrow from me passing it today. But what it can do for me is it can change the playing field for the world, because we have seen countries try to challenge various parts of monopolies in this crisis. Even Brazil, whose leader remains cynical about the crisis, even they were like, wait a minute, this is getting ridiculous. And if folks know, Brazil is one of a lead kind of drug manufacturer for South America. So when they move, the continent can kind of move around them. But we've seen folks issuing compulsory licensing. Even Israel at one point was issuing a compulsory licensing on remdesivir. Gilead just lost a challenge when Russia issues a compulsory license against them. But each time a country does that, that wins it in one country. And what we need is for all countries, because we can't go in everyone's systems one at a time, we will never win. Well, that's not true. We could win. It will just take forever when we all recognize there's a similar problem. So I guess where I want to go is where would you want a group of folks, who have energy, they're excited, they're enthusiastic about access to medicines. How do you think they should direct some of that energy to make more equitable expansions around vaccines? But also, how do you parlay that into energy for other drugs? I mean, you brought up a number in this conversation of areas where we're like still getting beat on by pharma. How do we both win the COVID fight, but also win all of the next fights, or make the next fights at least easier for ourselves?
Yeah. So, I've been, I've been always constantly challenging MSF on one of the things that really, really troubled me in pneumonia was that, pneumonia vaccine, it's that, Pfizer and the other company, I'm forgetting the name, they would give us a subsidized price. They would give us a different price from rich governments. And we always wanted as MSF to be able to find manufacturers in developing countries to be able to make them and be completely independent of Pfizer and other big pharma companies. So that we could bring down the prices to a few cents instead of minimalistic reduction in price. And that's what I want to talk about donations. Donations are very attractive. Donations are something that almost attracts everybody. If you donate, it's like donating money. You feel less guilty about yourself more than anything else. It's much more difficult to actually go out and do something, actually volunteer in a community, or actually, for that matter, find out what's wrong with the system. So donation is the easy way out. And right now, what the US is doing is taking the easy way out by offering the donations. I'm not saying that donations are not needed, but donations are not the only things that are needed. And donations are just not sustainable. As I said, they reach a fraction of the people who really need them. And then you have to play God and decide who gets them and not. So I think in that sense, I think it's really very crucial for those who want to, support this battle on access to treatment and vaccine, is to look beyond the words about donations and actually see why, treatment activists like me in India are saying, let's change the system. If you fix the system, you are going to be fixing the system in a manner that is much more sustainable, So we don't have to come back and ask you for a donation of antiviral drugs, which may be coming out next year. What we will be doing is making those antiviral drugs ourselves with the technology we have homegrown and going about a business of treating COVID-19. So I think the donations are an easy way out on the conscience. The harder way is to look at more sustainable solutions. So if you are more interested in sustainable solutions, then I think we can, be part of the access movement, join organizations like Health Gap, support them on the campaigns, but also support MSF in its big fight to support the Trips Waiver.
Are there any proposals that are floating around right now that you think need more energy, more legs, that people should be really more interested in? I mean, we all know about some of the failings of COVAX. Yeah, but what, has anyone put something out there that you're really like excites you as a access to medicines activist?
As much as how much COVID-19 has had an impact on our mental health, everything that COVID-19 has led to has brought people together. Like, when we saw the COVID-19 outbreak in India, what we noticed was how many people didn't have access to insulin, and the battle on insulin is so big in the US, right? People's glucose fluctuates and, people just didn't have, the government system just didn't have enough insulin to be able to stabilize them. We've seen in COVID-19, people take drugs that actually need more safety or efficacy data. And what we are looking at within COVID-19 is that everything's wrong with the R&D system is sort of playing out in COVID-19. Whether it is Gilead Sciences drug Ambisome, which is a shortage for the fungal infection, opportunistic infection drug. So if you're looking to join the battle, I think the battle lies at different levels of, what do we do about treatments? Can we do something about treatments? That's one. Can we do something about testing? Yes, there are a huge number of trade secrets that Roche and other companies have. Do you want to do something about vaccination? What more can I do beyond donations? And I think this is something that the whole community of people who call themselves activists but are all kinds of experts. In the UK, people are doing the Right to Know campaign, which is asking Oxford what agreements you've signed with pharmaceutical corporations over the vaccine that they have produced. Similarly, we would love to know, for example, what kind of intellectual property exists on Pfizer's mRNA vaccine, and how can we challenge it? Can we challenge that intellectual property that Pfizer has on the mRNA vaccine in a number of countries? So I think these are the battles that are brewing, as I would say, and some of us here, I think it's not just a few months of vaccination. We are out of COVID. We are here to stay. And I can tell you from my experience of having worked on HIV and hepatitis C, COVID is in our communities. It's not going away. And we want to be able to be prepared to fight for the treatments that are coming down the pipeline. So track the drugs, follow the pipeline, find out the clinical trial data, do exactly what we did for AIDS, follow the science, and follow the companies who have the intellectual property on them, and force governments to do something about the treatments.
Yeah, I always tell people, read those preprints and show up to that regulatory hearing, because if they feel challenged at the regulatory hearing, they will be afraid of you because they don't want their drug not to get approved in the country.
Exactly.
And you can ask some questions that are very pointed that can make that regulatory hearing very uncomfortable for them. Questions from the audience. Keep sending them in, folks. I will start with that on top. First question is, what can we do to get all of Europe on board? I would say Europe is weird. Europe is slowly coming on board. So the EU says that they support a waiver now, which is weird. The Germans are pretty much the only holdouts now in Europe. It seems like the path is breaking. We're supposed to get Macron this week will announce that France is fully supportive. It's been a march, and you have to keep watching them because the EU also has a separate proposal that they're calling their version of the third way proposal. All these third way proposals are just the old way, but rebranded with new names. Like, it's still letting pharma choose and do contract manufacturing to decide who and when they want to work with, which doesn't actually give us more vaccine doses. So be suspicious of third way things. Leena, anything on that from you?
Whenever you work on changing the rules about sustainable access, people always tell you to compromise. So I think the European Union has come 20 years too late. And even I think the USTR today recognizes that, some of the rules around intellectual property at the World Trade Organization are just not fit for purpose for the pandemic. So, compulsory licensing, even though we are great champions of it, it really is something very important. We can't imagine countries having to do compulsory license drug by drug, product by product, country by country. So the proposal that we use compulsory license is actually quite late in the day. It should have been easily available for HIV/AIDS. That's one. Our lives were made hell when Thailand issued a compulsory license and so on. So the third way proposals are more about keeping pharma happy, to not rock the boat, and I think that's where the third way proposals are all headed. The pharmaceutical corporations are at their best in the lobbies. They're spending millions of dollars lobbying in the United States, lobbying in the European Union. I have no doubt they're lobbying as we speak in India as well. So I think it's pharma dollars versus people's power. That's where we are today, and that's what the third way is all about. Pharma saying, let's find something that's already there, and sorry that we stopped you from using compulsory licensing before, but please go ahead and use it for COVID-19, So that's what the third way is all about. And I think this is a very interesting equation where pharma's putting all its dollars on lobbying to prevent the Trips Waiver, or I would say sort of removal of intellectual property barriers to COVID-19 life-saving treatments and tools. And on the other hand, are people who sort of saying, sorry, we really support the waiver. So it's people versus pharma dollars. And I think this is where the equation is exactly at this point of time between activists and pharmaceutical corporations.
I saw a question in the chat. I'll just for about Germany and the UK. The UK, there are a bunch of UK activists working on this. Just Treatment has been spending a lot of time, as well as the People's Vaccine Alliance, trying to pressure the UK into getting along here. Germany, interestingly enough, is going into an election cycle. So if people know folks in Germany who want to make signs and bird dog candidates, I bet there's someone at Right to Health Action who can choose you a really great bird dog candidate, how to teach you how to really be good at bird dogging candidates. There we go. His name is Paul Davis, and I've done a number of bird dogging trainings with him. It's a great tactic, and it can do wonderful things. Next question I've got, how can wealthy nations help developing/poor nations develop their own pharmaceutical industries, especially during these dire times? Leena, that's a great one for you.
Actually, everyone in the developing world was told that, you don't really need to, make these medicines and vaccines yourself. I know that, for example, a lot of people just said, to a lot of African nations that, it's just not sustainable for you to make these drugs and vaccines. And now, of course, COVID has hit and everyone realizes they need to be, the manufacturing power is concentrated in a few hands, in the hands of a few countries. And they, of course, will try and protect their own people. Understandable. But if we are to make medicines and vaccines, you have to do what India did, which is put public money into manufacturing and building the labs that will support manufacturing, one. Number two is this, remove intellectual property barriers. Straight away, tell your manufacturers that you will not be sued for making those medicines or vaccines or trying to export them. And number three is that this is a lot about equality. This is not about charity. So, I would be, as American activists, the one thing I wanted to tell you is this, that building manufacturing units in developing countries should not be a charitable act. It should be an act of partnership. We should not become contract manufacturers. We should really have access to the technology. And if mRNA works for COVID-19 and then it works for cancer, well, that's very good. That's the kind of sustainable solution that we really need. So we don't produce vaccines, mRNA vaccines, only for COVID-19. We use the technology for other life-threatening diseases as well. So if people are very supportive of U.S. supporting manufacturing in developing countries, it has to be an equal equation. It has to be an equal partnership. This is not about charity. This shouldn't be about donations. It should be about, history being put right. A lot of countries today who are struggling to make medicines and vaccines were basically countries who were colonized, and India somehow fought back against the colonization that it had lived through for hundreds of years and managed to make its own medicines and vaccines. And I think that's exactly where other regions and other countries should be headed. This is about putting injustice right and then being able to be more sustainable yourself. So yeah, pharma is telling governments that, you're talking about COVID-19 waivers and then they will use the technology for other life-threatening diseases. Absolutely. Once you learn mRNA technology in any country, you should use it for other diseases as well, and not just for COVID-19. And if the United States really wants to support countries in building these manufacturing units, more than the money, give us the technology. So I think that's really important, and stop companies like Pfizer from threatening us with court cases if we utilize the technology. Yeah.
We got a question in the chat about the billionaire philanthropy class and their donations. I will tell you, the billionaires are great in a world where you're okay with the status quo. They've given a lot of money, but it's about how they got that money. There's a reason that the Gates Foundation is always quiet on issues of IP, because their money comes from tech who loves their IP. And so you'll never see Gates putting efforts into challenging IP pretty much anywhere in the world. And that trickles down to all of their programs, which means that they're always willing to pay a higher premium price for products. And one of the things I do notice is if you want your dollars in terms of like service money to go further and actually supporting people, you should be working on access to medicines, because you cannot have them all be eaten by the cost of the medicine. Like every dollar we spend on drugs, a dollar less we can spend on programming to support people and what they need to do to be able to take and sustain their lives on said drugs. So the billionaire class has a special place. If you're bored, you should read the book Winners Take All. Talks about how billionaire philanthropies and how they got there, and maybe they're not as great as we like to think they are. But that's just my 2 cents on the matter. Nothing too tricky. I've got what are the upcoming US companies with COVID vaccines in the pipeline? For example, Novavax, for example, are we in a position to challenge their approach to regulatory approval contingent on their expansion of vaccine manufacturing capability and IP globally? So the current setup of the US government is unlikely to do that. We could try to push them to do that for sure. And given that how much money we've given all these companies, it might be nice that we actually made them do things. Also, interestingly to note, almost the majority of COVID technologies are not possible without this nice little piece of IP that allows us to, on the spike protein that's held by NIH. And we never use that as a leveraging mechanism to get NIH and the US government to push for more access. But the US has a lot of levers they could pull on people. We just choose not to. And there's no real good reason not to. Which probably will happen with Novavax is we will take the 100 billion doses that we have in the US already ordered, and we will add that to our donation pile, but probably with the same breakdown as the last 80 million. So 75% going to COVAX and the rest going to areas of strategic American concern. Also kind of terrible that we decide like that. I also forgot to say earlier, to Leena's point on kind of all the colonizing we've done, it is almost a form of reparations. You tell a country that they don't need to create an industry to make them dependent on you from all the resources that you strip from their country, and then say, oh, you don't have any resources. Let us sell them back to you at a premium or give you in a donation with less of a pile than you actually need. So, cynical Matt, maybe I'm just a big leftist. Maybe we should give back to the people that were colonized. I'm looking especially at you, the UK, since you colonized most of the world. Just saying. Let's check it. Wait, can we work on policies that medicines with trials conducted on global South having affordability in there? 50% of FDA-approved trials are not on US soil. So, Leena, what do you think about access standards for when the trial is conducted, that there's an access piece? I know on the HIV side, we have done some stuff. We constantly get in fights when a trial finishes that if your drug works, you at least have to give it to everyone in the trial, let alone, if not, greater community access. How does that look for you all?
Yeah, so the South Africans have done some stellar work on this. For example, recently the J&J vaccine, which was being trialed in South Africa, they managed to reserve 30% of what was being produced on the J&J single dose vaccine in South Africa for South Africans. So there are many times these clinical trials that happen in our country, but we don't have post-trial access. And I think increasingly some work is being done around it. But also, I just wanted to sort of highlight is that, right now, at this point of time, I was just reading an article last night about, people living with HIV and pregnant women and, doses being required for Pfizer and Moderna's mRNA to provide, to develop the data that would allow people living with HIV and pregnant women to benefit from vaccination. And Moderna and Pfizer are just refusing to give the doses for the clinical trials. Or delaying giving the doses for clinical trials. And I think this is where when people talk about monopolies, they forget that monopolies not only impact actually access, they impact research itself, So for those who are looking for very effective vaccines for people living with HIV, many of the vaccines may not be as effective in people living with HIV. And one of the studies that was being done is to look for which vaccine would be the most effective in people living with HIV. Well, those studies are actually being stunted without access to the mRNA vaccine. So I think we are at a point where we are looking at end of delivery of vaccines, but we also need to look at how research is being done and getting stunted by monopoly power.
Well, I think that takes us to our time for the panel. For folks who are interested in some of the other work that I do, I just dropped a link in the chat about a talk we'll be giving next week on funding. Woo! Everyone loves appropriations because you need money to pay for stuff. Leena, how can folks find you? They want to continue following your work.
Oh, great. So I'm actually quite easily available. If you just do a Google, you'll probably find my phone number and email quite easily. I actually have, I'm a public domain person, but you can contact Doctors Without Borders and the Access campaign specifically. We have an excellent website, lots of material, and people are joining, for example, different initiatives like the People's Vaccine, which has been very, very effective in challenging some of the rules around vaccines and the delivery and donations. And the manufacturing. So you can join and look for the People's Vaccine links. You can look at what MSF Access campaign is doing. My email is pretty much in the public domain, so feel free to write, and I will be happy to share any information or other material that we have, or to just have a chat. My email is there with the organizers, so please feel free to contact them and get it. Yeah.
Well, excellent. I'm passing it back over to our great friends at Right to Health Action, and they will close out in groups.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing, Matthew and Leena. I definitely agree with all that was shared today. My name is Pranav Savanur, and I'm an incoming MPH candidate at Yale School of Public Health. I've worked with results on their domestic and global anti-party issues, and I currently research global health at Kansas State. I serve on the policy team, fundraising team, and as the state team captain for Kansas with Right to Health Action. I want to give a huge thank you for all our panelists and moderator for a really engaging discussion, and to all of you for submitting such thoughtful questions. I hope that today's discussion has helped you appreciate the fundamental link between vaccine access and putting an end to not just this pandemic, but all pandemics, creating a pandemic-free future worldwide. If this conversation you have heard today struck a chord with you, we encourage you to join us in advocating for the crucial policies discussed by our panelists today. There are countless ways for you to get involved in this work, but for today, we'll focus on just 3. One very easy action you can take is to send a letter to President Biden urging him to vaccinate the world. This action will just take 2 short minutes. Second, and the most important action you can take, is to join the Right to Health Action team in your state and meet with your members of Congress to encourage them to back key policies for equitable access to medicines, starting with our next lobby week on June 14th. We are doing more than 120 lobby visits over the next 2 weeks in support of a bill sponsored by Representatives Krishnamurthy, Jayapal, Senators Warren and Merkley. We need all hands to make sure Congress hears us and supports this bill that will boost vaccine access, support tech transfer, and scale up global manufacturing. Third action you can take is chat with your friends and family about what you learned during this webinar and the other work Right to Health Action is doing. Spreading awareness is key to growing our movement. We have shared several resources you can read for more information and forward to others. Please refer to the chat box to access the links to the action items I just spoke about. If you have any questions about how to get involved, you can put them in the chat or learn more about visiting our website at righttohealthaction.org. Also, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@r2haction.org. And with that, we're going to move on into our next portion of this webinar, small group discussions.